The boardroom on the 38th floor of the Von Premier Group Tower was the kind of room built to make people feel small. Glass walls, Italian leather, a view of the city that turned everyone inside it into a silhouette against the skyline. At the head of the long table sat Callista Vaughn, 28 years old, chestnut hair falling past her shoulders, dressed in a black V-neck sheath that managed to look both elegant and merciless. At the far end stood Dante Whitaker, 29, broad-shouldered, dark brown hair cropped neat, a wrinkled white shirt clinging to him after a sleepless night on the laundry floor. It was about to be erased. Callista did not raise her voice. She simply said the words. Termination effective immediately. Badge revoked. Email locked. No severance. No farewell. No chance to retrieve the small frame drawing of his daughter from his desk. By the time the elevator doors closed on him, she believed she had cleaned up a problem. She did not yet know she had just created the most dangerous competitor of her life. The crisis that had brought Dante to that room was supposed to belong to someone else. A guest at one of Von Premier's flagship properties on the Gulf Coast had complained that the bed linens carried a sharp chemical odor and the bath towels felt stiff and abrasive. An internal sweep had turned up several batches of textiles processed through the wrong sanitation cycle. If word leaked to the trade press, 3 resort partnerships worth nearly $90 million a year were at risk of walking away. Callista needed a name to attach to the failure. Her chief financial officer, Clinton Graves, 52 years old and polished as a riverstone, had spent the morning maneuvering the conversation downward, away from the executive suite, and toward the operations floor. It was Clinton who, 6 months earlier, had championed the switch to a cheaper third-party laundry vendor. It was Clinton who had quietly trimmed 2 layers of quality control from the supply chain. And now it was Clinton, seated at Callista's right hand, who described the situation as if Dante alone had failed to hold the line. Dante carried a folder. Inside were copies of every email he had sent to Clinton over the past 3 months. He had warned them about the new vendor's harsh detergents. He had flagged unreliable delivery windows. He had documented the risk of cross-contamination between properties and described in plain language exactly the kind of incident that had just occurred. No one had ever replied. "You were paid to run the floor," Callista said, her voice low and even, not to assign blame to leadership strategy. Dante held still for a beat. Then he said, quietly, "If the company keeps chasing the cheapest number on the page, this incident will repeat on a much larger scale." The room did not breathe. The sentence had landed too close to a truth Callista did not want spoken in front of the board members on the video screen. She felt the heat rise in her chest. She felt the eyes of every senior executive at the table, waiting to see whether the young chief executive would tolerate being challenged in her own boardroom. She did not tolerate it. Termination. Effective now. Security was called. His badge was pulled across the table. His company email was locked before he had finished walking to the door. There would be no return to his desk. No chance to retrieve the small framed photograph of Matilda. No chance to recover the worn notebook in which he kept 3 years of operational notes. A human resources associate handed him a cardboard box at the lobby. Inside it sat 2 pens, an old planner, and a plastic bead keychain his daughter had threaded together at school. Dante did not raise his voice. He did not slam the table. He looked at Callista once, the way a man looks at something he wants to remember exactly, and then he walked out. When the elevator doors closed, Callista believed she had silenced an inconvenient employee. She did not know she had just handed away the only person inside Von Premier who truly understood how its bones held together. To understand what Callista had just thrown away, one had to understand who Dante Whitaker actually was. His father had worked for nearly 30 years inside a small industrial laundry on the outskirts of a Rust Belt town, processing linens for hospitals, hotels, and uniform contracts. Dante had grown up inside the noise of those big tumble dryers and the hiss of pressurized steam. He learned, before he learned almost anything else, how to read a load by smell, how to spot a faulty seal, how to tell when a boiler was running too rich or too lean. He learned that the clean tablecloth in a hotel restaurant and the sterile gown in a maternity ward all began in rooms the public never thought about. He had been on a path to engineering school when his father died of a heart attack at 56, and the path closed behind him. A year later, his young wife, Helen, lost a long fight with an illness that had been quietly eating at her since before Matilda was born. Dante was 26 when he became a widower with a 4-year-old daughter and a stack of medical bills. He took the steadiest job he could find. The title was modest. The medical coverage for his daughter was not, and that was the part that mattered. Inside Von Premier Group, Dante was the man who arrived before a problem became a disaster. When a flagship property ran out of clean bath towels at 2 in the morning, Dante was the one routing a backup truck from a contingency lot. When the kitchen uniforms for a new restaurant arrived in the wrong sizes, Dante drove the swap himself. None of this appeared in the quarterly slide decks. When the floor ran smoothly, credit traveled upward. When something broke, names like Dante's surfaced quickly. What set Dante apart was that he had never grown bitter about it. He could see unfairness without becoming an unfair man. He believed honest work would eventually find its value, even if no one in a glass tower agreed yet. At home, he became somebody else entirely. His apartment was small, on a quiet street near the school. The furniture was second-hand, but the place was clean and the kitchen always smelled like something warm. Matilda was 7 years old now. Light brown hair. Big watching eyes. She did her homework at the kitchen table, with a worn cloth rabbit, propped against the sugar bowl. The same rabbit she had carried since she was a baby. She did not ask for new toys. She did not complain when supper was canned soup and toast. She had a habit of saying, in the small voice of a child who has paid more attention than the adults around her realize, "My dad fixes everything." Callista Vaughn was not stupid, and not even, in the cruelest sense, cruel. She had inherited the Von Premier Group from her father 18 months earlier, in the middle of a board meeting where his words slurred, mid-sentence, and the room went quiet. Her father survived. His ability to run the company did not. Callista had been the only Vaughn in the room with the credentials, the temperament, and the last name to take the chair. And so she had taken it. In a tailored suit, at the age of 26. The board had never quite believed her. She was too young, too photogenic, too easy to dismiss as the daughter playing dress-up. So she had become harder than she needed to be. She let no decision look soft. She measured success in quarterly margins, because margins were the only language the board respected, and she pushed every department to cut what it could. Clinton Graves had read that need in her the way a card sharp reads a tell. He brought her one elegant cost reduction after another. Switched the linen vendor doctor. Reduced the inspection frequency. Shortened the testing window. On the spreadsheets, every move sang. Down on the operations floor, the foundation began to rot. Callista did not visit the laundry floor. She did not speak to the inspectors who could tell, by the smell of a folded towel, whether the chemical balance was off. She did not ride along with the drivers running routes designed without regard for traffic patterns or temperature requirements. She believed that the people in the boardroom understood the company better than the people in the loading bays. She believed that a man like Dante Whitaker, with no degree and no title beyond operations manager, was a small variable in a large equation. Her flaw was not arrogance exactly. It was distance. She had been taught that leadership meant looking at the whole picture from above, and she had not yet learned that some pictures only make sense when you are standing inside them. Dante sat in his old pickup for a long time after the elevator delivered him to the street. The afternoon sun caught the keychain Matilda had made for him, the plastic letters spelling "Dad fixes everything." For the first time in his adult life, he was not sure that was a sentence he could keep alive. He drove to the school. Matilda came running across the pavement the way she always did, her backpack bouncing, her face lighting up the moment she saw him. She hugged him around the waist, then stepped back and looked up. Children miss very little. She saw before he could speak, that his work badge was not clipped to his belt. "Daddy," she said, "did you forget to wear it today?" He told her the company had changed its plans. He kept his voice level. He drove home with one hand on the wheel and one hand resting lightly on the top of her head. That evening, while he was warming soup at the stove, Matilda saw the cardboard box in the corner of the kitchen. The 2 pens. The planner. Dot chain. The plastic keychain inside the box this time instead of on his belt. She put her rabbit down on the chair and walked over. "They don't need you anymore," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a small sentence, said softly, as though she were confirming something she had already begun to suspect. Dante turned off the burner. He could survive Callista and Clinton, and a boardroom of people who had decided that a man in a wrinkled shirt did not deserve their attention. He could not survive the look in his daughter's eyes when she began to wonder whether the world was going to take their apartment away. He pulled her into his lap. He told her, in the simplest words he could find, that he had lost his job, but that he had not lost his hands, and his hands had built a life for them before, and would build one again. Matilda placed her rabbit gently into his arms. "If they don't need you," she said, "somewhere else needs you more." That night, after Matilda had fallen asleep with the rabbit tucked under her chin, Dante opened the old laptop on the kitchen counter. At first he searched for jobs. The listings began to blur. Every one of them led to the same picture. Another building, another title, another room full of executives who would never see him until they wanted somebody to blame. He typed something different. Industrial laundry liquidation. DUA. Commercial uniform service for sale. Closed processing facility. A listing appeared near the top of the page. The sign was rusted. Harborline Laundry and Uniform Yard. Closed, 18 months. Bank owned. Urgent sale. A normal man would have closed the screen. Dante leaned in. The next morning, Dante drove out to the edge of the port district, past the freight yards and the truck repair shops, to the address listed in the auction notice. The neighborhood smelled like diesel and salt water. The sign over the gate, faded almost to the color of bone, still read Harborline Laundry and Uniform. George Mercer, the broker handling the property for the bank, was waiting in the lot in a wrinkled coat and the kind of slightly mocking expression a man develops after a long career of watching dreamers walk away from dead buildings. He was in his early 50s, gray at the temples. He looked Dante up and down. Then he looked at the cracked windshield of the pickup, and he said, almost gently, "Son, the only thing this place is good for now is the steel and the dirt underneath it." He pulled the gate open and led Dante inside. The factory floor was vast and silent. Dust drifted in shafts of light through gaps in the roof. The industrial washers stood in rows, their drums still, their hoses limp on the concrete. The big tunnel dryers had been partially stripped, but their frames were intact. The boiler in the back had a slow leak around one fitting, but the casing was sound. The sorting bay had been left in chaos, baskets tipped over, half-folded uniforms still lying in cubbies where someone had given up mid-shift. George kept talking as they walked. The bank wanted the property gone. 2 real estate developers had walked the site already and asked only about the land. A scrap dealer had bid on the equipment for a fraction of its weight in metal. Nobody, George said, wanted to run the thing. Dante did not answer. He moved through the building the way a doctor moves through an emergency room, cataloging what was broken and, more importantly, what was salvageable. In the front office, behind a desk drawer that had jammed shut, he found a stack of old client files. Restaurants, outpatient clinics, boutique hotels, private schools, rehabilitation centers. A list of small and mid-sized accounts that had once been the bread and butter of Harborline, before the big national vendors had moved in and squeezed them out. Most importantly, in a folder marked simply licensing, he found a copy of the facility's medical textile handling permit. It had expired 16 months earlier. It had not, however, been revoked. A reactivation, properly filed, was possible. Expensive, but possible. Dante stood in the middle of the silent floor. He thought about Callista's voice telling him he had nothing to offer. He thought about Matilda, asleep in her bed, holding the rabbit she had pressed into his arms. He put one hand on the steel side of the nearest washer, wiped a thick stripe of dust away with his palm, and uncovered the painted logo underneath, faded but intact. "You're not dead," he said softly, as if speaking to a tired animal. "You've just been left alone too long." That night, he sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of him, a calculator beside it, and a cooling cup of coffee at his elbow. He did not allow himself to dream in large numbers. He wrote down each line in plain ink. Purchase price negotiated against the bank's eagerness to clear the asset. Minimum repair, cost ID. Utilities for the first 3 months. License reactivation. Insurance. 2 initial employees. Fuel for 1 delivery truck. Detergents and softeners that actually met the standards the cheap competitors had abandoned. The number at the bottom was large. It was also, just barely, possible. He spoke with the bank by phone the next morning. The loan officer had clearly heard 100 pitches for this exact property and rejected 98 of them. Dante did not pitch. He sent her his spreadsheet, his 3-year revenue model broken out by client segment, the list of small accounts he intended to call first, and a photograph of the licensing folder. The next afternoon she called him back. She said in a voice carefully scrubbed of emotion that the bank was prepared to consider his offer. His oldest friend told him he had lost his mind, that a widowed single father could not gamble his daughter's stability on a rusted-out laundry. Even George Mercer, who stood to earn a commission whether the deal went through or not, sat across from him in a diner near the docks and said, "Find another job, son. There is no shame in working for somebody else." That evening, Matilda saw the sketches of the floor plan spread across the table. She climbed onto the chair next to him and studied them with the gravity of a child considering an animal at the zoo. "Daddy," she said, "are you going to fix a whole broken company?" He smiled, tired. "Maybe." She thought for a moment. "Is it like my rabbit?" "When everybody said the rabbit was too old, you stitched her up. Maybe the company is just like that." He did not answer in words. He simply looked at her and felt something in his chest settle. He sold his newer car for a fair price and kept the old pickup. He took out a second loan against a small life insurance policy he had been refusing to touch since Helen died. He emptied a savings account intended for Matilda's college fund and replaced it, in writing, with a promise to himself that he would rebuild it twice over. He signed the papers on Harborline laundry and uniform on a windy Thursday morning. There was no applause. Only a man in a worn jacket standing in an empty parking lot, a key in his palm, knowing exactly what would happen to his daughter if he was wrong. The first day, he unlocked the front gate at 6 in the morning and let himself in. The building exhaled a sour smell of mildew and old grease. He propped open the loading doors. He swept the entrance bay clear of leaves and dust. He laid out his tools on a folding workbench. He had no money for a crew of mechanics, so for the first 6 weeks, he was the crew. He replaced belts. He flushed boilers. He pulled apart the panels of 3 of the 4 big washers and rebuilt their motor mounts by hand. He climbed onto the roof and patched the holes in the wind. He called the old employees from the dusty roster he had found in the office. Most did not call back. Some did, and what they said was bitter. Harborline had owed them weeks of wages when it had folded. 2 of them told him in different words that the place was a graveyard and they had buried friends in it. 2 of them agreed to meet him. The first was Bonnie Hale, 61 years old, who had run inspection at Harborline for 22 years. She walked into the empty office with her arms folded and asked him point blank what he thought he was doing. He told her simply that he could not pay her what she had been worth a decade ago. He could pay her on time, every 2 weeks, and he would not throw her under a bus if a customer complaint landed on his desk. She watched him for a long moment. "Mr. Whitaker," she said finally, "I worked here for 30 years, and I have never heard an owner say that second sentence out loud." The second was George Mercer. Dante had asked him, half as a joke, whether he would consider driving the first delivery route until the company could afford a real driver. George had laughed for the better part of a minute. Then he had stopped laughing because Dante was still standing there, and Dante was not joking. George started the next morning. Dante began the slow, humiliating work of finding the first client. He picked up the phone and dialed every small account on the dusty list. He left voicemails. He took insults. A clinic manager hung up on him twice. A boutique hotel manager told him that Harborline had once lost 40 banquet linens during a wedding, and the bride still mentioned it. A restaurant owner told him the very name Harborline made her wince. He did not argue. He told them the old Harborline was gone. The equipment had been rebuilt, the management was new, and he was willing to handle one small contract for 1 week, with no penalty if anything went wrong. The first contract came from Bernice's Table House, a small Italian restaurant run by a widow in her late 60s named Bernice Tate, who had known Dante's father in the old days. She did not award the contract because of nostalgia. She awarded it because Dante's pricing was honest, and because he answered every one of her questions about chemical safety with patience. He washed the first load himself. He folded the first stack of tablecloths himself. He delivered them at 5 in the morning, in a clean uniform he had pressed the night before in his own kitchen. By the end of the 3rd month, Harborline had 6 clients. By the end of the 6th, 19. By the end of the 9th, he made the first scheduled debt payment on time, in full, and bought Bonnie a better chair for the inspection room and Matilda a pair of new shoes. There was a night during this stretch when a tunnel dryer locked up at 1 in the morning, and he stayed in the building until almost dawn, fixing it. Matilda had come to the office that evening because there was no one else to watch her, and she had fallen asleep on a worn couch in the corner under his jacket. When she woke up, the sky outside the windows was still dark, but the dryer was running, and Dante was wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Did you win, Daddy?" she asked. He smiled, exhausted. "Not yet. But today, we didn't lose." By the end of his first year, Dante understood that Harborline could not survive as a small laundry alone. The big national vendors would always undercut him on raw price. What they could not do, however, was care. He renamed the company. The new sign went up on a Saturday morning, plain white letters on a navy field. Whitaker Service Group. The new company kept the laundry at its core, but it offered 4 things around it. It managed inventory for clients with a simple color-coded system, so that no restaurant ever ran out of napkins on a Friday night, and no clinic ever discovered, mid-shift, that it was short on gowns. It rented uniforms on a monthly subscription, so that small businesses did not need to lay out cash up front. It partnered with a local tailoring shop to mend, replace, and label garments on a rolling schedule. And most importantly, it offered a transparency report on every batch processed, so that a client could see which load had been treated with which chemicals and what the inspection results had been. Dante was not selling laundry anymore. He was selling certainty. He invested modestly in better lighting on the floor, in clearer signage at the sorting bay, in standardized labels any worker could read without guessing. He held a 15-minute meeting every morning before the first shift. If something had gone wrong the day before, the team looked first at the system, then at the process, and only then at the person. If a driver had been late on a route, the route was redesigned. If a sorter had mislabeled a load, the labels were reprinted. No one was thrown out as a warning to the others. The word began to move, in the slow, honest way good word does. Restaurant owners told other restaurant owners. Clinic managers told one another. A boutique hotel that had been quietly losing money to a national vendor signed a contract and never went back. A regional rehabilitation center, struggling with state inspections, signed on after a single trial week. Dante bought a small uniform tailoring shop 2 streets over, one that had been quietly going under. He bought a struggling local delivery firm and folded its 3 trucks into his fleet. Each time he made an acquisition, people shook their heads. They asked why he kept buying assets nobody else wanted. He said he was not buying assets. He was buying links in a chain that had been cut. By the end of the second year, Whitaker Service Group was no longer the bones of Harborline. It was an ecosystem of services for the very kind of mid-sized businesses the giant vendors had stopped seeing. Restaurants, clinics, hotels, spas, private schools, small surgical centers. A small empire built quietly on the things that had been left behind. The most striking thing about it from the outside was how unspectacular it looked. No glass tower, no press releases. Just clean floors, on-time trucks, and workers who knew the name of the owner's daughter. While Dante had been rebuilding, Von Premier Group had been quietly coming apart. At first, the numbers had looked beautiful. The first 2 quarters after the vendor switch showed an 18% reduction in textile costs. Clinton Graves walked into board meetings holding the variance report like a trophy. Callista had grown used to walking into those rooms with the wind at her back. Beneath the surface, the cracks spread. The cheap vendor began to slip deliveries. Routes were missed. Towels arrived warm and damp because the trucks were running too long between properties. Restaurant aprons shrank after a few cycles. One of the resort partners discovered, during a celebrity wedding, that a stack of banquet linens had stains that had simply been folded out of sight. There were warnings, but they did not climb. The mid-level managers who had watched Dante's firing had absorbed the lesson it was meant to teach. They learned to keep their concerns inside their own heads. The breakage came in a single weekend. A photograph of a stained bath towel began to circulate publicly, the property's logo clearly stitched along its hem. 2 major trade publications picked the image up by the following Monday. A state public health inspector requested a full audit of laundry handling protocols. 2 resort partners sent the same message to Callista. 30 days to put in place a credible new textile partner, or they would walk. Callista sat in her office very late that night. She pulled the archived email files. She read every warning Dante had ever sent. The dates were carefully time-stamped. The language was careful, professional, almost apologetic. He had described the disaster, 6 months in advance, almost line for line. She did not cry. She had trained herself not to. But she pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead for a long time and did not move. The next morning she had her advisors begin the search for a new vendor. The national firms, called in haste, were too expensive, too booked, or unwilling to take on a client carrying a public scandal. Smaller firms were skeptical. 2 of them, in private conversations with her director of procurement, mentioned the same name without prompting. A regional player who had quietly taken over many of the small accounts in the area, with a reputation for delivering exactly what it promised. Whitaker Service Group. Callista did not recognize the name. She asked for a profile of the founder. The folder was placed on her desk that afternoon. She opened it. The face on the first page was the face she had told to leave her boardroom 2 years earlier. She closed the folder very slowly. She did not speak for a long time. She did not delegate the meeting. She drove herself out to the address on the docks the next morning. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was composed. She had spent the entire night convincing herself that this would be a transaction like any other. The neighborhood was not what she had imagined. It was clean. The fence around the property was painted. The trucks parked in tidy rows along the side of the building bore a small Navy logo and a phone number, nothing more. A worker in a clean uniform held the door open for her, recognizing her car but not, evidently, her face. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of detergent and fresh paint. A large schedule board hung on one wall, colored squares organized by client and route. Workers passed through quickly, but without panic. They greeted one another by name. They greeted Dante by name when he walked through, and the greetings were respectful, not afraid. A framed photograph hung on the far wall. It showed Harborline as it had looked the day Dante had bought it, the rust on the gate, the cracked asphalt, the broken windows. Beside it hung a recent photograph, The same building, repainted, the floodlights on, the trucks pulling out at dawn. Between the two photographs, framed under glass, hung a child's drawing in crayon. A square building with a yellow roof. Beneath it, in the careful, uneven letters of a 7-year-old, the words "Dad fixed it." Callista looked at the drawing for a long time before she looked away. Dante entered the conference room in a dark, simply cut suit. He was the same man she had thrown out of her boardroom. Taller than she remembered. Quieter. He shook her hand. He invited her to sit, and Clinton Graves, who had insisted on accompanying her, to sit also. Callista began with the formal language her advisors had drafted for her. Von Premier Group required a partner capable of absorbing a high volume of textile work on a 30-day implementation timeline. Dante did not interrupt. When she finished, he asked her in careful sequence exactly how many properties were involved, what their inventory positions looked like, what the current vendors' exit terms were, what state inspections were pending, and what the contractual exposure to the resort partners actually was. Every question landed exactly where it needed to land. Callista's team passed papers back and forth across the table. At one point, the director of procurement glanced at Callista with an expression somewhere between admiration and quiet pity. Dante slid a draft contract across the table. The terms were generous, but unsparing. Von Premier would commit to a 3-year minimum contract so that Whitaker Service Group could justify dedicating a separate production line to its volume. Payment terms would be honored on time. Pricing would not be renegotiated downward in a way that would compromise quality standards. Every quality complaint would be investigated beginning with the system, only ending with an individual, if the system itself was sound. And Whitaker Service Group reserved the right to suspend service if Von Premier ever again instructed its vendors to cut hygiene standards in pursuit of margin. Clinton Graves spoke up. He suggested in his polished way that the pricing was too high. Dante placed a second folder on the table. Inside was an analysis. The real cost of Von Premier using its previous low-cost vendor was computed, line by line. The damaged linens. The customer refunds. The penalty clauses with the resort partners. The crisis communications firm hired the previous month. The lost bookings. The settlement reserve. The total was several times what Von Premier had believed it was saving. The room went quiet. Callista did not look at Clinton. She looked at Dante. "Did you build all of this?" she asked, out of harbor line. Dante glanced toward the office window. Matilda was sitting at the front desk swinging her legs, the rabbit on her lap, a homework folder open in front of her. He looked back at Callista. "I didn't build it out of harbor line," he said quietly. "I built it out of the day you told me I had nothing." Callista signed the contract. She signed it without renegotiation. She signed it in front of her own team, with her own pen, and she did not flinch when Dante's general counsel slid the second copy back across the table for her initials. She did not, however, leave when the meeting ended. She lingered while her staff packed up the briefcases and stepped out into the lobby. She watched Matilda carry a small lunchbox over to her father and ask, in a serious whisper, whether the company had won today. She watched Dante kneel down to her level and tell her gently that today the company had helped several more families keep their jobs. She had been taught, by her father, and by every consultant and every board member who had crossed her path, that leadership was the management of fear, the fear of failure, the fear of losing market share, the fear of being seen as weak. She had run her company on that fear, and the company had begun to die of it. Dante had built his out of the opposite material. Responsibility to his daughter. To the workers he had inherited. To the small clients no one else wanted. To the building itself. She walked over to him as he was about to leave. She did not give him a polished apology. She said simply, "I treated you like a low number on a payroll spreadsheet." He looked at her for a long moment. He was not angry in the way of a man who had been waiting for this moment. He was not soft, either, in the way of a man who would forget too easily. He was steady. "That is why your company nearly lost everything," he said. Because you didn't only look at me like a number. You looked at the whole system that way. In the weeks that followed, the board quietly opened an internal investigation. Clinton Graves was removed from his role within a month. The operations division was restructured. A new escalation policy was written into the company's bylaws, granting protection to any employee who raised a safety concern. The company survived. It did not, however, walk back into its old skin. Dante continued to expand. He bought a struggling commercial linen rental firm the next year, and a small uniform manufacturer the year after. Each time, the trade press asked him the same question. Why did he keep buying companies everyone else had abandoned? Because I used to be one of those. The final scene of his story would have looked, to a passing visitor, like a small thing. The lights of the Whitaker Service Group facility came on at 5 in the morning. The trucks pulled out toward their first stops. Steam rose pale and steady from the vents on the roof. Dante stood at the gate, Matilda beside him in a small jacket, the worn rabbit tucked under her arm. She tilted her head up toward him. "Daddy," she said, "did you really turn a dead company into an empire?" He took her hand and looked out across the lot at the trucks and the workers and the long, ordinary, hard-won morning. "No, sweetheart," he said. "I just kept looking at it after everyone else stopped." The day Callista Vaughn threw Dante Whitaker out of her tower, she believed he had walked away with nothing in his hands. She had not understood that the same hands that had once fixed broken machines, that had once carried a child through nights of grief, that had once pulled a dead business back into the daylight, were the largest fortune a man could carry. And that sometimes, the greatest empires do not begin with what we are given, but with what the rest of the world has already thrown away.